We can just do questions for like general discussion. So do we have anything from the talks today that people want to bring back up as a general point for discussion or trying to connect ideas that we talked about so far today? Or is everybody wondering whether they're a simulation now and does it even matter? Oh, great. We do have a question. So I'll go first.
And this question would be for anybody who spoke today, or for anybody in the room. When you look at the process, and you think of software and hardware, what drives the process? Now, and the reason why I'm asking this question is because, like, I learned Fortran, okay, and I could write a Fortran program, but there's Python and C and Java and all this new stuff, okay? So when is it going to get to the point where the software, like, I can't use Fortran anymore? Does that make sense, that question? I'm trying to find out what is going to drive, what is going to continue to drive the AI,
You ask
the prices.
about extinction. Your question is about when do I go extinct? And it's basically when your lunch is eaten by somebody else. This is when you get into extinct. So basically, if somebody is able to completely outcompete you and you have no deterrent, and it wants your lunch because it subsides on the same type of lunch that you do, and you're not part of some complex food chains that has dependencies on you, you're going to go extinct, on average.
So if AI eat less than us, do they exist less than us?
I don't think that existence in a sense makes sense, right? Existence is a very vague predicate. It's especially when you try to measure it as something that you want to have, right? It's good to exist, so we should exist more. This leads to very counterproductive ideas. Yeah. Basically, for instance, if we say that our government doesn't do a long game, so we cannot incentivize our government to manage us in such a way that we can overcome the short games of people. Right? The US government plans like 6 years ahead in the future, the US military maybe 50 years. That is not enough to survive for a species. We cannot incentivize the government to do this longer because then it gets outcompeted by the government that only plans for the next years because it has an easier time to get elected by saying popular things and proposing currently popular policies. And the same thing happens for cooperation. Or cooperation with a very long game is that refuses to play the short game is going to be outcompeted by those that do the short game. Right? You only can do this with a regulation that forces people to have a longer game. It's not a question of values, because people will adopt values that help them in the world, and the people with values that are not good for evolution will die out. This is not a choice. You are not free to take arbitrary values. If you take the wrong values, you will die. Values are something that ultimately helps your group. As an individual, you might not notice, because you're basically bound to this group. If your group has wrong values, the group is going to die as a whole, unless you can get out of this value attractor.
So we need to make good programmable values for civilizations?
The thing is, if you are able to reprogram your values, you will not adhere to them. It's really a catch-22. So you have to be forced to accept values in such a way that they program you in a way that makes it very hard for you to let go of them, which you observe in people which have strong values, right? If you have an ideology, it's very hard for you to let go of this ideology because it seems to be objectively right. It's just the curvature of the moral space. And so it's very hard to do this, but civilizations die. Like communist Eastern Germany, my country, died, even though everybody kind of sort of believed in it, right? So you have values that die as a whole.
That's entertaining. Okay.
Sort of related, let's see if I can formulate this question. I've kind of asked different forms of this. But in terms of the development of AI, there's a lot of talk about values and reasoning and so on. But it seems in our human consciousness, emotions are a primary driving factor. And in terms of what I've read, like Antonio Damasio, emotions are tied to a sense of self and identity. And sort of as an organism, kind of arise out of sort of a monitoring of mixture of internal and external states and sort of gauging the health of the overall system. And it doesn't seem like any kind of AI has that kind of self-referential and sort of conscious kind of monitoring. And do we want AI to have that, one? And two, would it be modeled on a human sort of emotional scale or system versus some other? I don't know. That's sort of a general, if anybody wants to address that.
Fred, is that a you question about values and emotions?
Well, I think it's certainly on the way. Can you get a mic over there, please?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if this is actually on, but yeah, it's on.
Well, I think the question is very germane to what we've been discussing. I would only make two observations.
Yes, that's right. I know it.
One is that, as I noted in my talk, I don't think AI are likely to come to wisdom or planetary intelligence on their own, but that such values need to be inculcated in those machines by those who build them. And I mentioned in that connection that the reason that I think that is that I don't take AI to be creatures of need. And one of the things that's involved in being a creature of need, in Kant's sense of that term, is what you're identifying with emotions. And then I would just say secondarily, if there's a latent sense of kind of determinism in your question that emotions are the drivers and therefore we can't really expect ourselves to attain planetary intelligence because there's just limits to what our emotional responses can be, I would only say that I think that emotions are an important way that we register information, but that they need not be decisive when it comes to action. And indeed, a lot of sort of personal formation, moral formation is about thinking about how you take emotional responses and then regulate them in ways that are acceptable or constructive.
So, the difference between awareness and consciousness, right? Because when you were talking about super consciousness and such, you were asking about, the need to slow down to make decisions and such. But it's also possible, I think, that you can have machines that are intelligent in the sense they're processing information, but not only will they not be conscious, there won't be any bare awareness, right? That whole beautiful idea of what is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a is even on the most root level is awareness, which is more than just I'm taking data in, right? Because the machine may be taking data in, but it's not like anything to be taking the data in. So I'm wondering that distinction between sort of consciousness as a sort of higher level self-consciousness versus just the root awareness, which is also what Chalmers was talking about in some sense.
Yeah.
So I was sort of running them together. We have, in psychology, they distinguish between maybe the contents of consciousness and arousal, like wakefulness, right? And so even if you're not focusing on an issue, you still have that kind of sense of wakefulness and awareness. And it could be that an artificial intelligence having nothing like a brainstem, for example, just doesn't even have that capacity for basic wakefulness. It could also be that consciousness it's more like a cluster concept, and we're just, it's sort of like perhaps the way life is, right? You were questioning the issue of, or you were talking about universal biology, but it could also be that the idea of life is a cluster concept, and we realize one type, and there are many other, maybe we're even just the tip of the iceberg. Well, maybe it's like that for consciousness as well. That's why I like boundary cases. So maybe AI consciousness is really different. That's a possibility as well. Interesting boundary cases on Earth would be like the split brain cases and the thalamic bridge case.
So I've just visited an AI company in San Francisco and looked at their avatars. There was a chatbot, and this chatbot, of course, was not aware of anything. And there was this question: how can we make this thing more believable? And the first thing I noticed is the eyes are pretty good; they even follow you through the room. But we need to get this thing to be aware of the fact that you are looking at it. So it should notice whether you are looking at it or not. And then I realized not all people notice when you look at them. It's a personality property. It depends on whether you are a nerd or a normie. Nerds usually notice when you look at them. Nerds usually don't. That means Yeah, I mean, when you try to find out if somebody works in tech or not, it is an interesting personality property because it's a good predictor. It's not 100%, but there's a significant correlation of whether you are aware that that I'm looking at you. So before I noticed this, I noticed that people that don't notice that you're looking at them, because before I learned this, I realized they dress differently and they invest less in their hair and so on. The hair might be completely clean, but they will not spend 20 minutes every day, and they will not go to the hairdresser 2 times a week to make their hair attractive, because they don't notice that people look at them, so they don't think it's important. And they don't look at them because they don't have an intrinsic interest in being looked at, because it doesn't change the way they think about themselves, right? So some people have an intrinsic thing built into them, a reward that they get for noticing this, because it's objectively important for evolution, what other people think about you, because it depends what kind of stuff you get, right? So if people think good things about you, chances are they're going to invite you again to a panel, even if you disagree with all the other panelists. So a good idea would be to basically, if you notice this, if you're a normie, the impulse is to shut up about these things where you disagree, make everybody else like you, so they invite you again. But in other, that means you have certainly a particular tribe of people that are different in these personality properties. And then but within this, you have people that are aware of that fact and not. So there's an interesting thing when people do something, do they know what they are doing and why? It's relatively straightforward to build a system that has drives. It's very easy to get the system to use these drives to pick goals. And then it's a little bit harder to make them learn what the world is like, so they pick the right goals in order to satisfy their needs, right? To satisfy all these drives. But to make that happen, this thing needs to make models of what it's doing, right? So it needs to be aware of the fact it's picking that thing because it hopes that this is going to be the result. And this level of awareness is typically what we look for when we try to find out if people are conscious. They are conscious not in a general sense. They're conscious of certain things. And most people are not conscious of most of the things, right? Very few people are conscious over a very large range of problems. Most people are not conscious over most things. This phenomenal conscious is the memory of experiencing a binding state, where you model the perceptual world with a single operator. But mostly conscious awareness, when we talk about this, is an attentional learning mechanism, where we figure out what we did, why, for what reason, and to what end.
But again, that's I'm distinguishing between consciousness, which you're saying is a focused awareness, and an intentional self-reflection, from awareness.
No, I didn't say that it's a focused awareness. I didn't use this word deliberately, because the memory of the binding state doesn't mean that it's a focused binding state. Your emotion is characterized by valence, but also an arousal, but also by attention. Your attention can be outwards or inwards, or it can be wide or narrow, or deep or shallow. And so you might have just unfocused attention.
I think we're getting into debates of details that might not be so, like, we can debate those all day. But so what? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So I was interrupting. I don't really need the microphone to be interrupting. So I think so we have like 2 minutes left. So I'm going to give the chance for like one more person to ask a question of anybody that they heard today, and then we're going to conclude at 3:00 with the public portion of today's program. So does anybody have a question?
Or are there any, do people like this type of...
Oh, sure, yeah. So we would love feedback from those of you that were here today. Please email the Beyond Center or deepthought@asu.edu. Hopefully you're thinking some nice deep thought now. But and let us know like feedback on the format. This is totally an experiment for us, so we're really appreciative of anything also for our online audiences if you enjoyed today's program and want more things like this. Okay, do we have any concluding questions?
And specify if you're a nerd or a normie.
Right. Do you notice when people are watching
you want to become more conscious.
Yeah, and you want to become
And
more
self-aware,
cautious
and
and be
aware in
more
general.
aware of the layers of simulation running in your brain. Okay, so with that, we will conclude today's session. I would like to thank all of our wonderful speakers for coming out and doing
you.
such a cool job today, and we had a ton of fun, and I'm so excited. Okay, cool. Thanks.